Hello and welcome back to Historian at Midnight. If you have been keeping me company through the long stories of empires, through the silver of Potosi and the sinking of the Spanish galleons, through the slow arithmetic of ruin and the strange sickness of too much treasure, then you already know the shape of what we do here. We take a single great story, one of the stories that explains how the world came to be the way it is, and we walk through it slowly, from beginning to end, in the quiet hours, while the rest of the world sleeps. Tonight, the story is the longest we have ever attempted. It spans 11 centuries. It begins in the mind of one man, a Roman emperor standing in the twilight of the ancient world, and it ends in the mind of another, the last emperor of the Romans, standing on the walls of a dying city as the enemy breaks through. Between those two men, between Constantine the Great and Constantine Palaeologus, lies the entire history of the Byzantine Empire, the empire that called itself Roman until its final breath, the empire that preserved the classical inheritance through 1,000 years of siege and schism and slow contraction, the empire that the West forgot or chose to forget, and that the East remembers. Still, in its icons and its liturgies and its abiding sense of what was lost. It is a story full of names that sound like poetry: Justinian and Theodora, Heraclius and the Persian War, Basil the Bulgar Slayer, Alexios Komnenos and the First Crusade, the Paleologi and the Last Long Twilight. It is a story of theological disputes so fierce that they consumed the energy of an entire civilization, councils that defined the nature of God, and riots over the wording of a creed. It is a story of walls that held for 1,000 years, of Greek fire burning on the water, of emperors blinded in the streets, and emperors who rose from the peasantry to the purple, of the Fourth Crusade and the greatest sack in medieval history, of the slow, grinding, century-by-century retreat, until nothing remained but the city itself, standing alone in the gathering dark. And it is, above all, a story of survival against every reasonable expectation. A state that should have fallen 12 times and did not. A civilization that kept the lamps lit through the long night of the early Middle Ages while the West forgot how to read. And a final chapter so strange and so sad that it has haunted the imagination of the world ever since. Before we drift into the centuries, take a quiet moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you feel like it, leave your location and your local time down in the comments. It helps other restless, sleepless people find their way to this little corner of the night, and there is something pleasant about knowing that somewhere far away, a stranger is settling under the same dark sky, listening to the same slow story. So get comfortable, let your shoulders sink into the bed, and let yourself ease into the tale of Byzantium, the empire that Rome became, the empire that outlived Rome by 1,000 years, and the city that held the world's desire until the very end. To understand how the Roman Empire became the Byzantine Empire, we must begin with a single man on a single afternoon on a road north of Rome in the year 312. The man was Constantine, and the afternoon would change the world. He was not yet emperor, not yet saint, not yet the founder of anything. He was one of several rival generals tearing the Roman world apart in the last of the civil wars that had plagued the empire for a century. The son of a previous emperor, Constantius, who had ruled the western provinces and died in Britain, leaving his legions to proclaim his son Augustus in his place. Across the Alps, in Italy, another claimant held Rome itself, Maxentius, whose father had been Constantine's father's rival, and who now controlled the ancient capital with its memories and its prestige and its enormous, slightly shabby population, still fed by the grain fleets from Africa, still living in the shadow of monuments they no longer knew how to build. Constantine crossed the Alps with an army hardened in the northern wars, perhaps 40,000 men, and he moved south toward Rome faster than Maxentius had expected. And Maxentius, rather than wait behind the Aurelian walls for a siege he might well have won, marched out to meet him at a place called the Milvian Bridge across the Tiber a few miles north of the city. And it is here, on the eve of that battle, that the story takes a turn that has been argued over for 17 centuries, because something happened to Constantine on that night, or on the march toward it, something that he himself later described and that his biographers recorded, and that the Christian Church would come to regard as one of the hinges on which the history of the world turns. The accounts disagree on the details, as accounts always do when the event matters this much. In one telling, Constantine saw in the afternoon sky a cross of light above the sun, and with it the words, in Greek, "In this sign, conquer." In another, he dreamed the night before the battle that Christ appeared to him and commanded him to place a Christian symbol on the shields of his soldiers. What is beyond dispute is that Constantine ordered his men to paint or affix the Chi Rho, the first two letters of Christ's name in Greek, X and P superimposed, on their standards, and that he went into the battle, the most important of his life, fighting under a Christian sign. He won decisively. Maxentius and much of his army were driven back onto the bridge and into the river, and Maxentius drowned, and Constantine entered Rome the next day as undisputed master of the Western Empire. And from that morning forward, although he would not be baptized until his deathbed a quarter of a century later, Constantine acted as a man who believed that the Christian God had given him the victory, and that the future belonged to that God and to whatever empire served him. It is almost impossible, from the distance we occupy, to feel the strangeness of what had just occurred. Christianity, at the start of the 4th century, was still formally illegal, still intermittently persecuted. The last and worst persecution, under the Emperor Diocletian, had ended barely a decade before, and its memory was raw. Christians were perhaps a tenth of the empire's population, concentrated in the cities of the East, suspect to their neighbors, their scriptures forbidden, their clergy liable to arrest. And suddenly, by the accident of one general's vision on a northern road, the faith of the persecuted found itself favored by the most powerful man in the Roman world. Within a year, Constantine and his eastern colleague Licinius issued the Edict of Milan, granting toleration to Christianity and restoring confiscated property. Within a decade, Constantine was openly favoring the church with money and legal privileges. Within a generation, his successors would make Christianity the only permitted religion in the empire, and the old gods would be driven from their temples, their statues broken or melted down, their priesthoods dissolved, their rites forbidden. The conversion of the Roman Empire, the most complete religious transformation of a great civilization in recorded history, had begun with a cross of light above a battlefield, and no one alive at the time, least of all Constantine himself, could see where it was heading. But Constantine was not merely the first Christian emperor. He was also, and this is the part that matters for our story tonight, the founder of a city. And the city would outlast his dynasty, his empire, his faith in its original form, and everything else he built. In the years after his victory, Constantine ruled the empire from a succession of western cities, Trier in Germany, Milan, occasionally Rome itself, but his gaze, increasingly, turned east. There were practical reasons for this, and they were compelling. The wealth of the empire, its population, its trade networks, its intellectual life, its most serious military threats, all lay in the east. The west, for all the prestige of the name of Rome, was a poorer, emptier, more exposed province. Any emperor who meant to defend the whole empire from a single throne would have to sit nearer the Danube and the Euphrates, the two great frontiers on which the barbarian world pressed, and Rome, the ancient capital, was now strategically irrelevant, a city of memories at the end of a long peninsula, far from any frontier that mattered. And so, in the year 324, after a final civil war that made him sole emperor of the entire Roman world, Constantine made a decision that would define the next 11 centuries. He chose to found a new capital, a new Rome, on the site of the ancient Greek city of Byzantium, a modest trading town on a triangular promontory commanding the narrow strait where the waters of the Black Sea pour through the Bosporus into the Sea of Marmara and onward to the Mediterranean. It is worth studying a map for a moment, even in your mind's eye, because the site was, and remains, one of the great strategic positions on the surface of the earth. The city would sit astride the sea route from the Black Sea to the Mediterranean, commanding the grain trade from what is now Ukraine, and astride the land route from Europe to Asia, commanding the trade in silks and spices that crossed from the east. It occupied a peninsula that could be walled on its landward side more easily than almost any other great site of the ancient world. It possessed a deep natural harbor, the Golden Horn, an inlet so sheltered that it has served shipping for nearly 3,000 years, and it lay at the exact midpoint of the empire's two great threats, near enough to the Danube to reinforce the Balkan frontier, and near enough to the Euphrates to dispatch armies to the Persian border. Constantine, in choosing this site, was acting as the greatest strategic mind of his age, and he knew it, and the men of the age knew it, and later generations would call the city simply the Queen of Cities, and mean it. The founding of Constantinople, on the 11th of May, in the year 330, was staged with all the ceremonial weight that the late Roman Empire could command. Christian rites and ancient pagan rites were performed side by side, Constantine tracing the line of the new walls with a spear, as Romulus had traced the walls of Rome, and Christian clergy blessing the ground that the spear had marked. The new city was furnished with monuments stripped from across the empire, statues and columns and obelisks brought from Egypt and Greece and Asia Minor, so that Constantinople from its first day wore the appearance of an ancient capital. Its senate was modeled on Rome's. Its population was fed by a grain dole from Egypt, as Rome's was fed from Africa. Its imperial palace, its great central avenue, the Mese, its forums and hippodrome were built to rival and surpass the originals. And it was, from the beginning, a Christian city in a way that Rome never would be. Not a single pagan temple rose within its walls, unless you count the temples converted to other uses, and its churches, above all the first great church of the Holy Apostles, where Constantine would be buried, stood at the center of its civic life. Constantine died in the year 337, 7 years after the dedication of his city, and was baptized on his deathbed by a bishop whose views would soon be declared heretical, and buried in the Church of the Holy Apostles, surrounded by empty sarcophagi meant for the 12 apostles, as though he were the 13th. The gesture tells you a great deal about the man, and about the empire he was creating. The fusion of Roman imperial ideology with Christian theology, the emperor as God's vice-regent on earth, the earthly kingdom as a reflection of the heavenly one. The theology was not yet fully formed. The tensions within it would tear the empire apart repeatedly over the following centuries. But the fusion had been made, and it would hold, through every schism and every heresy, for 1,100 years. The empire that Constantine founded would come to call itself, simply, the Christian Empire, and its emperor, the equal of the apostles, would govern a realm in which the boundaries between church and state, between theology and politics, between loyalty to the faith and loyalty to the throne, were so completely blurred that they were barely distinguishable. That blurring is the central fact of Byzantine civilization, the key that unlocks everything that follows. It was also, as we shall see, the source of its greatest strength and its greatest vulnerability, and the reason that so much of its energy was spent, over so many centuries, on questions that a modern mind struggles to take seriously. Whether the Son was of the same substance as the Father, or only of similar substance, whether Christ had one nature or two, whether icons were windows into heaven or graven images forbidden by Scripture. The empire staked its unity on the answers to those questions, and fought civil wars over them, and exiled saints, and burned books, and deposed patriarchs. And the reason it did so is that, in the Byzantine understanding, the emperor's first duty was to maintain the orthodoxy of the faith, and the empire's survival depended on God's favor, and God's favor depended on the empire's purity. Get the theology wrong, and the barbarians come. It was not a metaphor. They believed it literally. and they governed accordingly. If Constantine's conversion and the founding of Constantinople mark the beginning of the Byzantine story, the 5th century marks its first great crisis, and the crisis was this. The western half of the Roman Empire, the half that Constantine had left behind, ceased to exist, and the eastern half did not. The question of why is one of the great questions of history, and it is the question that the Byzantine Empire spent the rest of its life answering. The standard narrative of the fall of the Western Empire is well known, and I will not spend the whole night retelling it, because this story is about the part that survived. But the fall of the West is the necessary context for everything that follows, and we must walk through it, at least quickly, to understand what the East was surviving. Through the 4th century, the pressure on the frontiers had been building. Germanic peoples, pushed westward by movements deeper in the Eurasian steppe, were crowding against the Rhine and the Danube, sometimes as raiders, sometimes as refugees, sometimes as entire nations on the move. In 376, a vast population of Goths, fleeing the Huns farther east, were permitted to cross the Danube into Roman territory, and the Roman officials charged with managing the crossing, corrupt and short-sighted, so badly mistreated them that the Goths rose in revolt. And in 378, at Adrianople, not far from Constantinople itself, they destroyed a Roman field army and killed the Eastern Emperor Valens, who had personally led it into battle. It was the worst Roman defeat in centuries, and the Goths were never expelled. They were settled eventually as semi-autonomous federates within the empire's borders, a precedent that would be followed again and again. And then, in the early 5th century, the Rhine frontier collapsed entirely. In 406, a great coalition of tribes, Vandals, Suebi, Alans, crossed the frozen river and poured into Gaul, and the Western government, already weakened by internal usurpations and the loss of revenue as provinces fell away, could not stop them. In 410, the Goths under Alaric, who had been wandering the Balkans and Italy for years looking for land and payment, sacked Rome itself, the first time the city had fallen to a foreign enemy in 800 years. The psychological shock of that event reverberated through the entire Roman world, east and west. Jerome, the great biblical scholar, writing from his monastery in Bethlehem, said that the city that had captured the whole world had now been captured, and Augustine, in North Africa, began writing The City of God to explain how a Christian empire could suffer such a catastrophe. But the psychological shock was not the worst of it. The worst was that the sack was a symptom of a structural collapse. The western provinces were falling away, one by one, to the barbarian peoples who had entered the empire and found no force capable of expelling them. Britain was abandoned by the legions in 410 and left to its fate. North Africa fell to the Vandals in the 430s, and with it the grain supply that had fed Rome for centuries. Spain was lost. Gaul was carved into rival barbarian kingdoms. By the 470s, the Western Emperor, a figurehead in Ravenna, ruled little more than Italy, and in 476, the last of the line, a boy named Romulus Augustulus, carrying by cruel accident the name of Rome's founder and its first emperor, was deposed by a barbarian general named Odoacer, who sent the imperial regalia to Constantinople with the message that the West no longer needed an emperor of its own, and the Eastern Emperor, Zeno, could be emperor of both halves, alone. The Roman Empire in the West was gone. Its provinces were now kingdoms: Visigothic Spain, Vandal Africa, Frankish Gaul, Ostrogothic Italy. Its titles survived in the church, its language survived in the liturgies and the law codes, but its structures, the administrative machinery of taxation and provincial government and army supply that had defined the ancient state, had been dismantled or abandoned, or simply withered from lack of resources. The population of the city of Rome itself, which had exceeded 1 million in the high imperial centuries, had collapsed to perhaps a few tens of thousands, living among the ruins of monuments they no longer understood, herding sheep in the Forum, quarrying the ancient buildings for stone. The West had entered what we now call the Dark Ages, and whether that phrase is fair or not, It is fair to say that the complex urban civilization of antiquity had given way, over most of Europe, to a rural, illiterate, fragmented world, in which even the memory of what had been lost was fading. And yet, in the East, the Roman state endured. The emperors in Constantinople still ruled over Egypt, Syria, Asia Minor, the Balkans, and the islands of the Eastern Mediterranean. The gold solidus, the coin that Constantine had introduced and that would remain the standard of Mediterranean trade for 700 years, still circulated. The imperial bureaucracy still functioned. The tax revenues still arrived. The armies still marched. The cities of the East, Alexandria, Antioch, Ephesus, Thessalonica, were still populous and prosperous in ways that the West could no longer imagine. And Constantinople itself, protected by walls that had not yet been tested, was growing into the greatest city of the Christian world, a city whose wealth and splendor awed visitors from the barbarian kingdoms of the West, as though they were provincials visiting a capital that had left them behind. Why did the East survive? Historians have argued about this for centuries, and the answer is not simple, but the strongest factors are these. The East was richer, first of all, and more urban, with a deeper tax base and more complex economy that could support a standing army and a professional administration without the constant crises that plagued the West. Its frontiers were shorter and more defensible. The Danube in the Balkans and the fortified cities of Mesopotamia against Persia, rather than the endless Rhine and the exposed plains of Gaul. Its politics were more stable. While the West suffered one usurpation after another, the East settled, after a rocky transition, into a pattern in which civilian officials at Constantinople exercised real control over the military, in contrast to the West, where barbarian generals came to dominate the throne. And Constantinople itself, with its walls and its harbor and its strategic position, proved impregnable in ways that Rome never had been, a capital that could not be taken, a heart that could not be cut out. But perhaps the deepest reason is also the most paradoxical. The East survived because it was willing to let the West go. The emperors of Constantinople, from the late 4th century onward, made a strategic choice that was as cold-blooded as it was successful. They would defend the East, and they would use the East's resources to buy off or divert the barbarian pressure westward, away from Constantinople and toward Rome. The Goths who sacked Rome had been in the Balkans first, and the Eastern government had paid them, directed them, and eventually encouraged them to move west. The Huns, who terrorized the East in the 440s before turning west under Attila, were paid off with enormous tribute, gold that the East had and the West did not, and the payments redirected the storm toward Gaul and Italy. The Eastern Empire was not, it must be said, a faithful partner to the West. It was a survivor, and survival, in that age, meant sacrifice, and the sacrifice it chose was the western provinces. The empire that Constantine had unified was divided again, not by any single decision, but by the slow arithmetic of strategic abandonment. And the eastern half lived because the western half died. If the 5th century was the century in which the East survived while the West fell, the 6th was the century in which the East tried to reverse the verdict of the 5th, and almost succeeded, and failed in ways that would define the empire for the rest of its existence. The man at the center of this story is Justinian, who reigned from 527 to 565, and he is one of the most extraordinary figures in the whole long chronicle of empires. A man of humble origin who came to believe that he had been chosen by God to restore the Roman Empire to its ancient borders, and who nearly did it, and who, in the attempt, exhausted the empire he was trying to save. He was born Petrus Sabatius in a Latin-speaking village in the Balkans, the nephew of a soldier named Justin who had risen through the ranks of the imperial guard to become emperor, largely by accident and old age, and who adopted his clever nephew and gave him the best education Constantinople could provide. When Justin died in 527, Justinian was ready. He had spent years learning the machinery of government, and when the purple passed to him, He was already formulating the program that would define his reign. That program had 3 parts, and it is worth stating them clearly because they were so audacious, and because they so exactly expressed the Byzantine ideal of imperial rule. To recover the lost territories of the West, to codify and reform the Roman law, and to enforce religious uniformity throughout the empire. One empire, one law, one church, under one emperor, at peace with God and with itself. It was a vision of almost breathtaking coherence, and it was pursued for nearly 4 decades with a ferocious energy, and it very nearly succeeded. To tell the story of Justinian properly, we must begin not with the conquests or the law code, but with the moment, 5 years into his reign, when the whole enterprise nearly collapsed before it had properly begun. In January of 532, Constantinople erupted in the most dangerous revolt that any Byzantine emperor ever faced. The factions of the Hippodrome, the Blues and the Greens, which were part sporting clubs, part political gangs, and part social affiliations that cut across every class in the city, united against the emperor's officials, and the crowds in the great stadium began to chant not the usual slogans of racing rivalry, but a single word, Nika, victory, which was the cry with which they had always cheered their charioteers, and which now became the cry of insurrection. For days, the city burned. Much of the imperial palace, the great church of Hagia Sophia, whole districts of the city were put to the torch. The rebels proclaimed a new emperor, a nephew of the previous emperor Anastasius, and Justinian, barricaded in the palace, prepared to flee by sea. And at this moment, when everything hung in the balance, the decisive voice was not the emperor's but his wife's. Theodora is one of the most extraordinary women in the whole history of monarchy, and her story still astonishes anyone who meets it for the first time. She was born, by the most reliable account, the daughter of a bear-keeper at the Hippodrome, and she had been, in her youth, an actress and a dancer, which, in the Constantinople of the 6th century, meant something closer to what we would call a courtesan, and placed her permanently outside the circle of respectable society. She had traveled through the cities of the East, born a child or children whose fate is unknown, and returned to Constantinople as a penitent, living quietly in a small house, spinning wool, when the emperor's nephew met her, fell entirely in love with her, and determined to marry her. It took a special law to allow a man of senatorial rank to marry an actress, and Justinian pushed it through. And the aunt who had raised him, the Empress Euphemia, refused to receive her and died conveniently soon after, and the marriage went ahead. And the woman who emerged from that marriage, when Justinian became emperor, proved to be the most formidable partner any Byzantine emperor ever had. Intelligent, ruthless, courageous, and, at the crisis of the Nika revolt, the one person in the room who refused to panic. The story, which comes to us from the historian Procopius, who was there and who hated her, records that when the emperor's counselors were urging flight and the ships were ready in the harbor, Theodora spoke. What she said, as Procopius reports it, is one of the most famous speeches in Byzantine history, and it deserves to be remembered in full, or as near to full as we can come. That flight was possible, and the ships were ready, and the sea was open, but that she, for her part, would stay. She would not, as she is supposed to have said, see the day on which she was not greeted as empress. And then she spoke the words that have echoed down the centuries. Royalty is a good burial shroud. The purple, she was saying, was the only winding sheet she would accept. The meaning was plain. To die an empress was better than to live as a fugitive. Justinian, shamed or inspired or both, stayed. The generals Belisarius and Mundus were ordered to suppress the revolt by force. The troops cornered the rebels in the Hippodrome, and the slaughter that followed left, by the most conservative estimates, 30,000 dead in the stands and on the sand of the track. The revolt was over. The reign was saved. And the man who had nearly fled the city went on to conquer an empire. The conquests that followed under the command of the general Belisarius were among the most astonishing military achievements of the late Roman world. And they are astonishing precisely because they were achieved with resources that seemed entirely inadequate to the task. The Vandal kingdom of North Africa, which had stood for a century since the fall of Rome, was destroyed in a single campaign in 533 to 534, with an expeditionary force of perhaps 15,000 men. Belisarius landed, won 2 battles, marched into Carthage, and the Vandal king was paraded through Constantinople in a triumph that recalled the ancient Roman triumphs that no emperor had celebrated in centuries. Then, the following year, the greater prize, Italy, where the Ostrogothic kingdom had ruled since the end of the 5th century. The invasion of Italy began in 535, and it would take nearly 20 years, not the single campaign that Belisarius had first imagined. But by 540 he had taken Ravenna, the Gothic capital, and the king was a captive, and Justinian was the master of Italy. In the same years, a foothold was established in southern Spain at the expense of the Visigoths, and the Mediterranean seemed, for a moment, to be becoming a Roman lake again, as it had been in the high imperial centuries. The empire of Justinian stretched from the Euphrates to the Atlantic, from the Danube to the Sahara, and the dream of restoration, the recovery of the lost West, seemed, from the palace in Constantinople, to have been achieved. But the dream was built on sand, and the sand was already shifting before the conquests were complete. The same years that saw Belisarius triumph in Africa, and Italy saw catastrophe on the empire's other frontiers, and catastrophe at home. The Persian Empire, the great rival of Rome for 7 centuries, attacked in the east, sacking Antioch, one of the greatest cities of the empire. The Slavs and the Bulgars raided across the Danube into the Balkans, reaching the walls of Constantinople itself. And in 541, out of nowhere, out of the invisible world of bacteria, came the plague. The Justinianic plague, as historians now call it, was the first recorded outbreak of bubonic plague in Europe, and it was, by any measure, one of the worst epidemic disasters in human history. It arrived first at the Egyptian port of Pelusium, at the eastern edge of the Nile Delta, and it spread from there along the grain ships and the trade routes to Alexandria and Constantinople and the cities of the east, and then, in wave after wave, across the entire Mediterranean world for 2 centuries. In Constantinople, at the height of the first outbreak in 542, Procopius records that the dead were piled in the streets and thrown into the fortifications on the Golden Horn because the cemeteries were full, and that the daily death toll rose for a time to 10,000 or more, though such numbers are always uncertain. The emperor himself contracted the plague and survived, which was read as a sign of divine favor, but the empire did not survive intact. The population of the Mediterranean, demographers now estimate, may have fallen by 1/3 or more across the 6th and 7th centuries in repeated waves, and the tax base and the recruiting grounds shrank with it, and the armies that Justinian had sent to conquer the West found themselves, by mid-century, defending positions with fewer men and less money than they had begun with, while the plague burned through the cities behind them. And then, in 541 or perhaps 542, a volcanic eruption somewhere in the tropics, possibly in Central America or Indonesia, threw such a quantity of dust and ash into the upper atmosphere that the climate of the entire northern hemisphere cooled for years, perhaps decades, and the chroniclers of the age in Constantinople and in Ireland and in China recorded the same strange phenomena. The sun dimmed for months at a time, the summers failed, the harvests withered, and famine stalked every land from the Pacific to the Atlantic. The historian Procopius, who had already recorded the plague, now recorded that the sun gave forth its light without brightness, as though in eclipse, for an entire year, and tree-ring data from every continent confirms a climatic disruption in these exact years of a severity unmatched in the last 2,000 years. The empire, already hollowed by plague, was now cold and hungry as well, and the great project of reconquest, which had seemed so triumphant in the 530s, was grinding to a halt under the weight of forces that no emperor could command and no general could defeat. Justinian himself, as the years accumulated and the news darkened, grew older and more isolated, and the court around him hardened into suspicion and intrigue. The historian Procopius, who had praised him in the official histories, wrote a secret history, the Anecdota, in which he portrayed the emperor and Theodora as literally demonic, demons in human form who had been sent to destroy the empire, and the portrait, however unfair, reflects something of the despair that settled over the reign as the conquests stalled and the treasury emptied and the frontiers collapsed. Theodora died in 548, and her death removed the one person who had ever been able to steady the emperor's darker impulses, and Justinian, alone, grew ever more consumed with theological details, the exact nature of Christ's body after the resurrection, the text of hymns, the endless, grinding, insoluble schism between the Orthodox and the Monophysites that was tearing the eastern provinces apart, while the armies withered and the plague returned, wave after wave, in 558, in 573, in 586. When Justinian finally died, in November of 565, at the age of 83, after 38 years on the throne, the empire was larger than it had been when he took it on the map. But the map was an illusion. Because the army was broken, the treasury was empty, the population was shattered, and the provinces he had conquered, Italy, Africa, Spain, were islands of Roman rule in a rising sea, garrisoned by skeleton forces under commanders who begged for reinforcements that Constantinople could no longer send. It is easy, sitting here in the dark, to judge Justinian a failure, and in the long run, he was. The Italy that Belisarius conquered was lost within a few years of Justinian's death to a new Germanic people, the Lombards, who swept down from the Alps and took the interior of the peninsula, leaving the empire only coastal strips around Ravenna and Rome and the south. The Balkans were overrun by Slavs and Avars, and the great cities of the interior, the cities that had been the backbone of Roman power in the region for centuries, were abandoned or destroyed or shrunken to fortified villages. The eastern frontier with Persia settled into an exhausted stalemate that would soon explode again into the last and greatest of the Roman-Persian wars, the war that would leave both empires so weakened that neither could resist the storm that was gathering in the desert to the south. And the treasury, the great machinery of taxation and disbursement that had sustained the Roman state for centuries, was so depleted that Justinian's successors were reduced to desperate expedients, melting down church plate and borrowing at interest from the wealthy, the first signs of the fiscal crisis that would never, in the remaining centuries of Byzantine history, be fully resolved. And yet, Justinian left three things behind him that would outlast every conquest and every plague and every bankruptcy, and they are things that still shape the world we live in. The first was the codification of Roman law, the Corpus Juris Civilis, the body of civil law, assembled by his legal minister Tribonian and a commission of lawyers in the early years of the reign, which gathered, organized, and reconciled 1,000 years of Roman jurisprudence into a coherent system. That system, rediscovered in the West in the 11th century, became the foundation of the legal codes of most of Europe and, through them, of much of the world. And the law student who studies contract or property or inheritance in a modern university is, whether she knows it or not, studying the mind of Justinian's lawyers, refined by centuries of commentary, but still, at the core, their work. The second was the Church of the Holy Wisdom, Hagia Sophia, the great church that Justinian rebuilt after the Nika revolt had burned the previous church on the site, and that he dedicated in 537, and that stood, from that day to the Ottoman conquest and beyond, as the supreme architectural achievement of the Byzantine Empire. The numbers barely convey it, but I will give them anyway. A dome rising 180 feet above the floor, seemingly suspended without visible support, so flooded with light from the windows at its base that contemporaries wrote that it appeared to hang from heaven on a golden chain. When Justinian entered the completed church for the first time, he is said to have whispered, in reference to the great temple of Jerusalem, Solomon. I have outdone you, and whether he said it or not, the men of the age believed he could have. For 900 years, every Byzantine emperor was crowned under that dome, and every patriarch celebrated the liturgy beneath it, and every visitor to the city who left a record of his impressions began with it, and the ambassadors of the Russian Prince Vladimir, sent to investigate the religions of the world in the 10th century, reported of the service in Hagia Sophia that they did not know whether they were in heaven or on earth, and that they could not forget the beauty of what they had seen. The church still stands in modern Istanbul, a mosque now, then a museum, now a mosque again. Its dome still floating, its mosaics still glimmering when the light catches them, and the Roman emperor who built it is still remembered there. And the third thing Justinian left, though he could not have known it, was the shape of the empire that would survive. Not the universal empire of his dreams, stretching around the entire Mediterranean, but a smaller, tougher, more coherent empire, based firmly in the East, Greek in language, and Orthodox in faith, and defensive in posture. The empire that would come to be called, by historians, though never by its own inhabitants, the Byzantine Empire proper. The age of Justinian was the last age in which a Roman emperor could seriously imagine reconquering the West. After him, the imagination contracted, and the empire contracted with it. And what remained, after the 7th century storm that was about to break upon it, was the thing itself. Byzantium, the Greek Christian empire of the Middle Ages, the survivor, the patient, the long-enduring. The dream of the universal empire died with Justinian. The reality of the particular empire, the empire of Constantinople and its hinterlands, was about to be born, in fire and invasion, and the most desperate century the Roman state had ever faced. The 7th century was the crucible. Everything that had survived the fall of the West, everything that Justinian had built and bankrupted, everything that the empire had been for 300 years since Constantine, was thrown into the furnace in the 7th century, and what emerged, battered and reduced and transformed, was the Byzantine Empire that would endure for another 800 years. It is the hinge of the whole story, the pivot on which everything turns, and it begins, as so many disasters begin, with a war that seemed, at the time, to be going well. The war was the last and greatest of the Roman-Persian wars, the final round in a struggle that had run, on and off, for 7 centuries, since before Rome had been an empire and Persia had been Parthia, since the days of Crassus and the triumvirs, of Alexander Severus and Shapur, of Julian the Apostate dying in the desert with a spear in his side. In 602, a century of uneasy peace between the two empires collapsed, and the Persian king, Khosrow II, launched an invasion that would, within a generation, carry the Persian armies farther into Roman territory than any Persian army had ever gone. The timing could not have been worse for Constantinople. The Emperor Maurice, an able soldier who had stabilized the Balkans after the chaos of Justinian's later years, was overthrown and murdered by a mutinous officer named Phocas, and the empire descended into civil war at the exact moment the Persian storm broke over the eastern frontier. Phocas was a brute and a usurper, and his regime alienated every constituency in the empire, and within a few years the provinces were in revolt, and the Persians were advancing, and the empire seemed, to every observer, to be coming apart at the seams. Into this darkness stepped the man who would become, by the judgment of most historians, the greatest of all the Byzantine emperors after Constantine himself, Heraclius, the son of the governor of Africa, who sailed from Carthage in 610 with a fleet, deposed and executed Phocas, and took the throne of an empire that was already losing a war on every front. The Persians had overrun Syria and were pushing into Anatolia. The Slavs and Avars had overwhelmed the Balkans, and the great cities of the interior, Sirmium, Singidunum, Salona, had fallen or been abandoned. The treasury was empty, the army was broken, and the new emperor, a man in his mid-30s with no great record of command, faced what must have seemed, to everyone around him, an impossible task. But Heraclius was not an ordinary man, and the 12 years that followed were among the most extraordinary of any reign in Roman history. For the first decade, he could do little but watch as the Persians advanced, taking Damascus and Jerusalem, where they carried off what was believed to be the true cross, the most sacred relic in Christendom, and then Egypt, the richest province of the empire, the source of its grain, lost for the first time in 700 years, and finally, in 626, reaching the Bosphorus itself, where an Avar army camped on the European shore, and a Persian army stood on the Asian shore, and Constantinople, the city that had never fallen, faced siege from the landward side for the first time in its history. The siege failed. The walls held, the imperial fleet held the strait, and the Avars, who could not storm the fortifications and could not be resupplied indefinitely in a burned countryside, withdrew. But the empire, by 626, consisted of Constantinople, a few strips of coastal Anatolia, and fragments of Italy and Africa. The rest was lost. The Roman Empire, the state that had ruled the Mediterranean world for 6 centuries, had been reduced, in effect, to a city-state with a navy. And then, in one of the most astonishing reversals in military history, Heraclius struck back. He had spent the years of retreat reorganizing what remained of the army, forging alliances with the Turkish peoples of the steppe who were pressing the Persians from the north, and above all, cultivating a new spirit in the empire, a sense that this was no longer merely a political struggle but a holy war, a war for the faith itself, to recover the cross and avenge the desecration of Jerusalem. In 622, he took the field personally, the first emperor to lead an army in the east since Theodosius the Great 2 centuries before, and he did not march to meet the Persians on the frontier. He struck into their heartland, across the mountains into what is now Iraq, campaigning year after year in the Persian rear, while the main Persian armies were still occupying Roman territory to the west. In 627, near the ancient ruins of Nineveh, he fought the decisive battle of the war, destroying the last great Persian field army and forcing Khosrau to flee, and the Persian nobles, tired of a king who had lost everything, overthrew him and sued for peace. The treaty restored the old frontiers. The true cross was returned to Jerusalem. Heraclius entered Constantinople in triumph, and the empire, against every expectation, had not only survived but won. But the victory was an illusion, because the empire that had won the war was a hollow shell, and the price of victory had been ruin. The treasury was not merely empty. The very economic basis of the ancient state had been destroyed. The great cities of the East, Antioch, Alexandria, Jerusalem, had been under Persian occupation for a generation, and the patterns of trade and taxation that had sustained them for centuries had been broken. The Balkans, meanwhile, were effectively lost. The Slavs had settled across the entire interior, and the imperial writ ran only along the coastal cities and the islands. The army was exhausted, the population was shattered, and the 2 great powers of the Mediterranean world, Rome and Persia, had spent the last of their strength battering each other into ruin. And it was at this exact moment, when both empires lay gasping in the dust, that the storm came out of the desert. The rise of Islam is, by any measure, one of the most consequential events in human history, and the speed of it still astonishes anyone who studies it. In 622, the year Heraclius took the offensive against Persia, a merchant in the Arabian city of Mecca named Muhammad fled with a small band of followers to the city of Medina, an event that Muslims call the Hijra, the migration, and that marks the beginning of the Islamic calendar. Within 10 years, Muhammad had unified the tribes of Arabia under the banner of the new faith. Within 20 years of his death in 632, his successors, the caliphs, had conquered Syria, Palestine, Egypt, and Mesopotamia, destroying the Persian Empire entirely and reducing the Roman Empire to a rump. Within a century, the Arab Empire would stretch from Spain to the Indus, and the Mediterranean, which had been a Roman lake for 700 years, would become a frontier between two civilizations. The world that Constantine and Justinian and Heraclius had known was gone, swept away in a generation by forces that none of them could have imagined. The conquest of the Roman East, when it came, was not a single dramatic battle, but a rolling collapse, province by province, year by year, as Arab armies that had learned to fight in the endless small wars of the peninsula proved faster, more mobile, and more motivated than the exhausted imperial garrisons that opposed them. At the Yarmouk River, in modern Jordan, in 636, a great Byzantine field army was destroyed in a battle that lasted 6 days, and Syria was lost. Jerusalem fell in 638 after a siege, and the Caliph Omar himself came to receive the city's surrender, riding in on a camel and refusing to pray in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, lest his followers later claim it as a mosque. Egypt fell by 642, its native Coptic population, alienated by the religious persecutions of Constantinople, offering little resistance to the new rulers. By the end of the 640s, the Roman Empire consisted of Anatolia, the coastal Balkans, the islands, and the scattered western possessions in Italy and Africa. The population of Constantinople, which had stood at perhaps 500,000 in Justinian's reign, had fallen dramatically. The empire's revenues, which had been measured in millions of solid in the 5th century, were now measured in tens of thousands, and the empire itself, the universal Christian empire of Constantine's dream, had become a Greek-speaking, Anatolian-based state, fighting for its survival on a single mountain frontier. The Taurus and anti-Taurus ranges that divided the Anatolian plateau from the Syrian plain, behind which the armies of the Caliph raided every year, almost every spring for 200 years. It was in this crucible that the Byzantine Empire, as we properly understand it, was born. The old Roman state, with its Latin language and its civilian bureaucracy and its separation of military and civil authority, was swept away by the demands of survival. In its place emerged a new order, the system of the themes, military districts across Anatolia, in which soldiers were settled on the land, given grants in return for hereditary military service, so that the empire could maintain an army without the money to pay one. The old provinces were replaced by military commands under generals, the strategoi, who combined civil and military authority in their persons. The language of government shifted from Latin to Greek, and the titles of the officials shifted with it. And the empire that had been the Roman Empire in outward form became, in the 7th century, something new. A medieval Greek state, orthodox in faith, defensive in posture, and organized from top to bottom for war. And yet it survived, and the survival itself is the most astonishing part of the story, because the Arab pressure did not let up. The conquests had halted at the Taurus Mountains and the Aegean Sea, but the raids continued, and in 674, the Arabs attempted the next logical step, the capture of Constantinople itself. The siege of 674 to 678 was the first of several Arab attempts on the city, and it was the first great test of the reorganized Byzantine state. The Arabs had built a fleet, having absorbed the naval resources of Syria and Egypt, and they blockaded the city by sea while their armies raided in Anatolia. And they returned year after year for 4 years, and the city held, supplied by the Black Sea, defended by its walls, and armed with a weapon that would become, in the centuries that followed, the most feared and the most mysterious in the Byzantine arsenal. Greek fire was a liquid incendiary, probably a mixture of petroleum, resin, and other ingredients whose exact formula was kept a state secret and has never been recovered. It was projected through tubes mounted on ships or on the walls, and it burned on water, and it could not be extinguished by water, and the Arab fleet that blockaded Constantinople in the 600s and 70s was devastated by it, ships going up in flames in the Sea of Marmara, while their crews, according to the chroniclers, jumped into the sea only to find the sea itself on fire around them. The Arab admiral withdrew, and his fleet was wrecked by storms on the voyage home, and the first great attempt on Constantinople had failed. A second attempt, in 717 to 718, with an even larger army and fleet, also failed, defeated by the walls, the Greek fire, and a winter so severe that the chroniclers record the Arabs eating their own horses and camels, and by the intervention of the Bulgars, a new people who had established a kingdom in the Balkans and who, at this moment, were allies of Byzantium against the common enemy. The failure of 718 was one of the decisive battles of world history, though it is rarely remembered as such. Had Constantinople fallen then, the entire history of Eastern Europe and the Mediterranean would have been different, and there would have been no Byzantine Empire to shield the developing polities of the Balkans and Russia from the Caliphate, no Constantinople to fall, in the end, to the Turks. The city stood, and the empire stood with it, and the Arab threat, though it would smolder on the frontier for another century and a half, had passed its peak. The 8th and 9th centuries, for Byzantium, were a season of contraction, adaptation, and the bitterest internal conflict the empire ever knew, the struggle over icons. It is one of the strangest episodes in the history of any great state, and it consumed the energy of the empire for more than a century, and it is worth understanding because it illustrates, more clearly than any other chapter, the peculiar character of Byzantine civilization, the way that theology and politics were so completely fused that a dispute about religious art could become the central political question of an age. The question, at its simplest, was whether Christians should venerate images, icons, of Christ, the Virgin, and the saints. The traditional practice of the Church, going back at least to the 4th and 5th centuries, was to use icons in worship, to bow before them and kiss them and light candles before them, and the theologians who defended the practice were careful to distinguish between veneration, which was directed to the person represented, and worship, which was due to God alone. But the distinction was a fine one, and it was always vulnerable to the charge of idolatry, the forbidden worship of graven images that the Old Testament condemned in the strongest possible terms. In the 7th and 8th centuries, as the empire shrank and lost province after province, the charge gathered force. Perhaps God was punishing the empire for its idolatry. Perhaps the astonishing success of Islam, a faith that forbade images of any living thing, was a judgment on the Christians for their graven gods. In 726, the Emperor Leo III, who had just defeated the Second Arab siege of Constantinople, and who was, like many of his countrymen, a soldier from the eastern provinces where the iconoclastic sentiment was strongest, made his views public. The icons were idols, and they must be removed from the churches. The Patriarch of Constantinople resisted and was deposed. The monks, who were the great defenders of icons and whose monasteries were full of them, protested and were persecuted. The Pope in Rome, whose authority in Italy was increasingly fragile, and who had no desire to take orders from an emperor he could barely tolerate, condemned the iconoclasts, and the emperor responded by transferring the provinces of southern Italy and the Balkans from papal jurisdiction to the Patriarchate of Constantinople, widening the rift between the Greek and Latin churches that would eventually split them permanently. For the next 60 years, the empire was torn by the struggle, emperors and patriarchs and armies and mobs lining up on one side or the other. Icons smashed and icons restored, and the chronicles of the age are full of stories of monks tortured for refusing to give up their holy images, and of imperial officials breaking into churches with hammers, and of the common people, especially the women, defying the edicts and hiding icons in their houses and pressing them into the hands of the dying. It is easy, from our distance, to find the whole thing incomprehensible, a dispute about art that consumed the energies of a civilization fighting for its life. But the men and women of the 8th century were not fools, and they were not fighting about art. They were fighting, or so they believed, for the soul of their civilization, for the right understanding of the incarnation itself. If Christ had truly become man, the defenders of icons argued, Then he could be depicted as a man. To forbid his image was to deny the reality of his human nature, to slide into the heresy that had plagued the Church from its earliest centuries, the belief that Christ was only spirit, only divine, not truly flesh and blood. And if Christ could not be depicted, then the whole structure of Byzantine piety, the icons in every home and every church, the saints looking down from the walls, the Virgin who was the special protector of Constantinople, all of it was false, and the empire had been living in error for centuries. The iconoclasts, for their part, believed with equal sincerity that the empire's disasters were the judgment of a jealous God, and that only the purification of the churches could restore his favor. Both sides were fighting, in their own minds, for the survival of the empire, and both sides believed, with a literalness that was the mark of the age, that the fate of the state depended on getting the theology right. The struggle ended after more than a century, in 843, when the Empress Theodora, ruling as regent for her infant son, convened a council that restored the icons permanently and condemned the iconoclasts as heretics. The resolution was celebrated with a great procession through Constantinople, the monks carrying their icons out of hiding, the people lining the streets, and the event is still commemorated in the Orthodox Church as the triumph of orthodoxy, celebrated on the first Sunday of Lent every year to this day. The empire had chosen its faith, and it had chosen the side of the images, and the decision would shape the whole subsequent history of Orthodox Christianity, its art, its piety, its sense of itself as the guardian of a tradition that had been tested and had survived. The resolution of the icon controversy opened the way for the great recovery of the 9th and 10th centuries, the period that historians sometimes call the Macedonian Renaissance, after the dynasty founded by Basil the Macedonian, a peasant from the theme of Macedonia who rose through the imperial household to murder his way onto the throne in 867, and whose descendants would rule the empire for nearly 2 centuries. It is a period that does not have the dramatic unity of the age of Justinian or the desperate heroism of the 7th century, but it is, in many ways, the period in which the Byzantine Empire was most itself. A settled, prosperous, confident, middle-sized empire, Greek-speaking Orthodox Christian, ruling from the Adriatic to the Euphrates and from the Danube to the islands of the eastern Mediterranean, the richest and most cultivated state in the Christian world, a beacon of order and ceremony and learning to the rougher kingdoms of the West. The 9th and 10th centuries were the great age of Byzantine missionary work, the conversion of the Slavic peoples to Orthodox Christianity, and the creation of what has been called the Byzantine Commonwealth, the cultural sphere that still, today, marks the boundary between Eastern and Western Europe. In the 860s, 2 brothers from Thessalonica, Cyril and Methodius, were sent by the emperor to evangelize the Slavs of Moravia, in what is now the Czech Republic. And they did something that would have consequences far beyond their own mission. They created an alphabet for the Slavic languages, the Glagolitic script, which their disciples refined into the Cyrillic script that is still used in modified form by hundreds of millions of people from Bulgaria to Russia to Mongolia. They translated the scriptures and the liturgy into Slavonic, the common tongue of the Slavic peoples, and they thereby gave the Slavs something that the Western Church, with its insistence on Latin, never gave the Germanic peoples: a Christianity in their own language, accessible, vernacular, rooted. The seeds they planted grew into the Orthodox churches of Bulgaria, Serbia, Romania, and above all Russia, which would become, in the centuries that followed, the greatest heir of the Byzantine tradition, the Third Rome, as its rulers would eventually call their capital of Moscow. The conversion of Russia was the greatest achievement of Byzantine cultural diplomacy, and it is worth pausing on the story because it illustrates the peculiar way in which the empire exercised influence, not by conquest, which it could no longer sustain, but by attraction and conversion and the sheer weight of its cultural prestige. In the late 10th century, the Prince of Kiev, Vladimir, was a pagan warlord ruling a loose federation of Slavic tribes from a wooden city on the Dnieper River. He was, by all accounts, a man of enormous appetites and a pragmatic interest in religion. The chronicles record that he sent envoys to investigate the faiths of his neighbors, the Latin Christianity of the Germans, the Islam of the Volga Bulgars, the Judaism of the Khazars, and the Orthodox Christianity of Constantinople. The envoys reported back, and the chronicle preserves their words, and they are worth hearing, because they capture the essence of what made Byzantium, at its height, so compelling. The Latin Rite, they said, had no beauty. The Mosque of the Bulgars had no joy. But when they entered the great church of Hagia Sophia and heard the liturgy sung, they did not know whether they were in heaven or on earth, and they could not forget the beauty of what they had seen. Vladimir, convinced, accepted baptism, and he compelled his people to follow him into the river, and Russia, in the space of a generation, became an Orthodox Christian kingdom, looking to Constantinople as its spiritual capital and its cultural model for the next 600 years. The same centuries saw the military recovery of the empire under a series of soldier emperors who pushed back the frontiers on every side. The Arabs, who had raided deep into Anatolia every spring for 200 years, were pushed back across the Taurus, and the frontier shifted from the mountains to the Syrian plain, and the great city of Antioch, lost since the 630s, was recovered in 969. The Bulgars, who had established a powerful kingdom in the Balkans and had repeatedly threatened Constantinople itself, were crushed by the most formidable of the Macedonian emperors, Basil II, who earned the name Bulgar Slayer by the thoroughness of his revenge. The climax of that war came in 1014 at the Battle of Kleidion, in the mountains of what is now southern Bulgaria, when Basil captured a Bulgarian army of thousands, and he did something that has echoed through the history of the empire ever since, a deed so terrible that it has its own place in the memory of the region. He had the captives blinded, every one of them. The chronicles say 15,000 men, every 100th man left with a single eye to guide the others home. The Bulgar king, Samuel, who had been encamped nearby, saw the procession of his blinded army stumbling through the mountain passes, and he collapsed and died of shock within 2 days, and the Bulgarian kingdom was extinguished and absorbed into the empire. Basil, who had been a sensitive and cultivated young man when he came to the throne, had become, over decades of hard campaigning, a man of iron. And he left the empire, at his death in 1025, at the greatest territorial extent it had achieved since the Arab conquests, and its treasury was full, fuller than it had been since the days of Justinian, and its frontiers were secure, and it must have seemed, to the men who lived in that moment, that the worst was over, that the empire had weathered every storm and entered a new golden age. And then, with a suddenness that still astonishes historians, it all came apart. The 11th century was the century in which the Byzantine Empire went from the greatest power in the Christian world to a supplicant state, begging for help from the West. And the collapse was not, in its origins, a military catastrophe. It was a political and economic one, a slow hollowing out from within that left the shell of the empire brittle and ready to shatter at the first hard blow. The Macedonian dynasty, which had ruled for nearly 2 centuries, came to an end with the death of Basil's niece, the Empress Theodora, in 1056, and the succession fell to a series of weak emperors, civilians and courtiers, who neglected the army and the frontiers in favor of the politics of the capital. The great military families of Anatolia, the families that had provided the generals and the soldiers who had defended the frontier for 300 years, were sidelined. Their lands encroached upon by the great landowners of the capital, their sons pushed out of the high commands. The army, the themes that had been the backbone of the empire's defense since the 7th century, was allowed to decay, its soldiers discharged and their lands converted to tax farms, while the government relied increasingly on foreign mercenaries, Normans and Franks and Varangians, who fought for pay and loyalty to nothing but their own commanders. And onto this weakened stage, in the middle of the 11th century, there appeared a new and entirely unexpected enemy from the east. The Seljuk Turks were a confederation of nomadic peoples from Central Asia, converts to Islam, who had swept out of the steppe and conquered Persia from the declining Arab Caliphate, and who now pressed against the eastern frontier of Byzantium. They were not at first an organized invasion. They were raiders, tribal bands pushing into the Anatolian highlands, probing the empire's defenses. But the empire's defenses, after decades of neglect, were not what they had been. The great frontier garrisons of the 10th century were gone, replaced by nothing but local militias and undertrained levies. And in 1071, the Emperor Romanos Diogenes, a soldier emperor in the old mold who had taken the throne by marriage to the widowed empress and who was determined to restore the army in the frontier, marched east to meet the Seljuks in a single decisive battle. The Battle of Manzikert, fought in August of 1071 near the shores of Lake Van in what is now eastern Turkey, is one of those rare battles that genuinely changed the course of history, though it did so not because of the battle itself, which was a manageable defeat, but because of what followed. Romanos, betrayed by the aristocratic rivals he had brought with him on the campaign, was defeated and captured by the Seljuk Sultan Alp Arslan, who treated him with surprising courtesy, offering terms and releasing him after a few days. But in Constantinople, the emperor's enemies had already seized the moment. They declared him deposed, and when Romanos returned from captivity expecting to resume his throne, he found himself facing a civil war, the worst possible outcome at the worst possible moment. The civil war consumed the empire's remaining strength for a decade after Manzikert, and in that decade, with no army in the field to oppose them, the Seljuks flooded into Anatolia, not as raiders now, but as conquerors, settling the plateau with their herds and their families, turning the heartland of the empire, the land that had been Roman for 1,000 years, into a Turkish principality, the Sultanate of Rum, Rome as they called it, the land of the Romans now ruled by the Turks. By the end of the century, the empire that had stretched from the Danube to the Euphrates in Basil's day had been reduced to the coastal strips of Anatolia, the Balkans south of the Danube, and the islands. The themes were gone, the eastern frontier was gone, the recruiting grounds were gone, and the Byzantine state, which had survived the Persians and the plague and the Arabs and the Bulgars, was now, for the first time in its 1,000-year history, a minor power. A Greek kingdom clinging to the edges of its former greatness, looking westward for help from a Europe that it had always regarded, with some justice, as a collection of barbarian principalities that had forgotten what Rome had ever been. The call for help, when it came, changed the history of the world, because it produced the Crusades, and the Crusades, in the end, would destroy the very empire they had been summoned to save. The Emperor Alexios Komnenos, who took the throne in 1081 at the age of 24, was the founder of the last great dynasty of Byzantium, and he was, by any measure, one of the most remarkable statesmen the empire ever produced. He inherited a realm in its death throes. The Normans, a new and terrifyingly effective power from southern Italy, had crossed the Adriatic and were carving out a kingdom in the Balkans. The Seljuks held most of Anatolia. The treasury was empty, and the army was whatever fragments Alexios could scrape together from the wreckage of the previous decade. Against all odds, he stabilized the situation, won back the Balkan territories from the Normans, and reorganized the army around the extended Komnenian family and its allies. A feudal structure in which the great landholding families provided soldiers in return for grants of land and privilege. A system very different from the old theme armies, but effective, for a time, in the crises of the late 11th century. But Alexios knew that he could not recover Anatolia alone, and in 1095, he sent an embassy to the Pope Urban II, asking for military assistance against the Turks. What he expected and what he got were very different things. The Pope, at a council at Clermont in France, preached a sermon that electrified the Latin West, calling for an armed pilgrimage to the Holy Land to recover Jerusalem from the Muslims. The response, when it came, was beyond anything Alexios could have anticipated, and beyond anything he could easily control. Tens of thousands of men, knights and peasants, lords and adventurers, set out across Europe for Constantinople, and the movement, which the West called a crusade, was not what the emperor had requested. Not a few companies of mercenaries, but an entire migration of the Frankish warrior class, bristling with weapons and enthusiasm and a profound mutual incomprehension with the Greeks they had come to assist. The two civilizations that met outside the walls of Constantinople in 1096 were, by that point, almost entirely alien to one another. The Greeks saw the Franks as violent, unlettered barbarians, children in politics, whose manners were coarse and whose theology was suspect. The Franks saw the Greeks as effete, treacherous, and perhaps not entirely Christian, with their bearded priests and their icons and their refusal to acknowledge the authority of the Pope. Alexios, with his characteristic diplomatic genius, managed the situation. He received oaths of loyalty from the Crusader leaders, ferried their armies across the Bosphorus into Anatolia, and used their momentum to recover substantial territories from the Seljuks, including the city of Nicaea, which had been the capital of the Turkish Sultanate barely a decade before. The crusade proceeded, against all expectations, to capture Jerusalem in 1099, after a siege of horror and butchery, and the Frankish lords established a string of principalities along the Levantine coast. The Crusader states, which would endure for the better part of 2 centuries. The relationship between Byzantium and the Crusader states was never easy, and it soured quickly. The Crusaders, having taken the Holy Land by their own blood, saw no reason to hand over conquered territory to the emperor, who had, in their view, done little to help them. Alexios and his successors saw the Crusader states as upstart usurpations, carved out of imperial territory that had been lost to the Turks, and they expected, with some legal justification, that the Frankish lords should acknowledge Byzantine sovereignty, however theoretical. The mutual resentment festered through the 12th century, flaring into occasional conflict, and the Franks, for their part, developed a narrative that would prove extraordinarily durable, that the Greeks were cowards and schismatics, that they had betrayed every crusade that followed the first, and that the recovery of the Holy Land was hindered, more than by any Muslim enemy, by the treachery of Constantinople. It was not entirely fair, and it was not entirely false, and it fed a hunger in the West that would eventually find its terrible outlet. The 12th century was, despite the frictions with the Franks, a century of recovery and relative prosperity for the empire under the 3 great Comnenian emperors: Alexios, his son John, and his grandson Manuel. The empire recovered large portions of Anatolia, pushed back the Seljuks, and re-emerged as a significant Mediterranean power, with a navy that controlled the Aegean and diplomatic reach that extended from the Holy Roman Empire to the Crusader kingdoms to the Fatimid Caliphate in Egypt. Constantinople, under the Komnenoi, was still the greatest city in Christendom. Its population recovered to perhaps 400,000, its markets full of goods from every corner of the known world, its court the most splendid in Europe, a labyrinth of ceremony and protocol that awed the rough Frankish knights who came to it as crusaders or pilgrims. The emperors of the 12th century still called themselves, and were still recognized as, Roman emperors, and their city was still the queen of cities, and the impression they made on visitors from the poorer, smaller, cruder West was one of almost unearthly magnificence. But the 12th century was also the century in which the structural weaknesses of the Komnenian system began to tell. The empire's recovery had been built on the personal authority of the emperors and the network of alliances they had constructed among the great families, and it was vulnerable, as all personal systems are vulnerable, to the accidents of succession. Manuel Komnenos, the last great emperor of the dynasty, died in 1180, leaving a child as his heir, and the familiar Byzantine pattern reasserted itself. A succession crisis, a coup, a counter-coup. the great families tearing at one another while the frontiers crumbled. The regency of Manuel's widow, a Latin princess from Antioch, was deeply unpopular among the Greeks, who resented her Western entourage and the commercial privileges that the Italian trading cities, Venice and Genoa and Pisa, had extracted from the Comnenian emperors. A usurper, Andronikos Komnenos, Manuel's cousin, seized the throne in a wave of anti-Latin violence, and then proved so brutal and so erratic that he was himself torn to pieces by a mob in the streets of Constantinople, an end so ugly that the chroniclers, hardened as they were to imperial violence, recorded it with something like shock. The empire that emerged from the chaos of the 1180s was a shadow of what it had been under Manuel. The Turks, who had been held at bay for a century, pressed forward again into Anatolia. The Bulgars and Serbs, who had been subdued for 2 centuries, rose in revolt in the Balkans and established independent kingdoms. And the Italian republics, above all Venice, which had come to dominate the trade of the Eastern Mediterranean with Byzantine permission and was now, increasingly, the true economic power in the region, watched the Greek decline with a calculating eye. The stage was set for the catastrophe that would break the empire in two. The Fourth Crusade, launched in 1202 with the aim of recovering Jerusalem from the Muslims, instead turned upon Constantinople and sacked it in 1204. It is one of the strangest and most shameful episodes in the entire history of Christendom, and it requires explanation, because the Crusaders who committed it were, by their own lights, not monsters. They were soldiers of the cross, pledged to fight the infidel, and they ended their campaign by storming the greatest Christian city in the world, burning a quarter of it to the ground, slaughtering its inhabitants, and carrying off its treasures to the churches and palaces of the West. The question of how this happened has been debated for 800 years, and the answer, as in so many of these stories, is a combination of accident, greed, fear, and the structural weaknesses of the enterprise that made disaster almost inevitable from the start. The crusade had been organized by a consortium of French and Flemish knights, and it had contracted with Venice to transport its armies to the Holy Land. But the number of crusaders who actually arrived at Venice was far smaller than expected, and the Venetians, who had built a fleet to carry the larger number and expected to be paid for it, demanded the full sum. The Crusaders could not pay. The Venetians, who were not a sentimental people and who had not built a fleet for charity, proposed an alternative. The Crusaders could work off their debt by capturing, on Venice's behalf, the rebellious city of Zara on the Dalmatian coast, a Christian city under the rule of the King of Hungary, who had himself taken the cross. The Crusaders, after internal agonies that the chronicles record, agreed. The Pope, Innocent III, the most powerful pope of the Middle Ages and the man who had called the crusade in the first place, excommunicated them for it. The excommunication was ignored, or its announcement was delayed, or it simply failed to halt an expedition that had come too far to stop. And then, at Zara, the next turn of the screw, a Byzantine prince, Alexios Angelos, whose father had been deposed and blinded by his own brother in the chaos of the 1190s, arrived in the Crusader camp with a proposition. If the Crusaders would escort him to Constantinople and place him on the throne, he would pay their debts, provision their expedition, put the Greek Church under the authority of Rome, and provide a permanent garrison of Byzantine soldiers for the defense of the Holy Land. The offer was too tempting to refuse, and it provided, moreover, a kind of moral cover. The Crusaders were not attacking a Christian empire. They were restoring a rightful emperor, and if the emperor then helped them recover Jerusalem, the entire enterprise would be justified. The Venetians, for their part, saw in the proposal something even simpler, the chance to install a dependent emperor in Constantinople who would confirm and expand their commercial privileges and make the Eastern Mediterranean, in effect, a Venetian lake. The fleet arrived before Constantinople in June of 1203, and the city, with its enormous walls and its towers and its million inhabitants, must have been the most terrifying sight any of the Western soldiers had ever seen. A city of a scale and grandeur that no city in the West, not Paris nor London nor Venice itself, could approach. The Crusaders, by a combination of naval assault and the intimidation of the population, forced the usurping emperor to flee, and their prince was installed on the throne alongside his blinded father. And for a moment, the plan seemed to have worked. But the new emperor, Alexios IV, was no more able to pay his debts than the Crusaders had been able to pay the Venetians. The treasury was empty, the taxes could not be raised, and the young emperor's promises to the Crusaders were impossible to keep. The Crusaders waited, camped outside the walls, increasingly restive and hostile, and the population of Constantinople looked on their new emperor and his Frankish allies with mounting fury. And the situation was a powder keg waiting for a match. The match was struck from within. A court official, Alexios Doukas, known as Mortsouflos for his thick, meeting eyebrows, seized the throne in the palace, strangled the young emperor, and declared himself the defender of the city against the Latins. The Crusaders, now outside Constantinople with no emperor to pay them, no fleet to take them onward, and a hostile garrison between them and the sea, made the decision that would, in later centuries, be condemned by popes and lamented by historians, and held up as the ultimate proof of the corruption of the crusading ideal. They would take the city for themselves. They would establish a Latin emperor of Constantinople, partition the empire among the Venetian and Frankish lords, and, they told themselves and each other, reunite the Greek Church to Rome, channel the wealth of the East to the crusading enterprise, and secure, at last, the permanent recovery of Jerusalem. The justifications were many and sincere. The sack that followed was neither. On the 12th of April, 1204, the Crusaders breached the sea walls of the Golden Horn, and the city that had resisted every siege for 900 years, since before the time of Constantine, fell in an afternoon. What happened next, in the 3 days of pillage that followed, is among the darkest chapters in the history of any Christian people. The soldiers, who had been told by their clergy that the Greeks were schismatics and worse than schismatics, fell upon the city with a fury that the chroniclers, even the Western chroniclers who were sympathetic to the enterprise, found horrifying. The great churches were stripped of their gold and silver, the altars were desecrated. The relics that had been gathered over 9 centuries were pried from their settings and carried off to the west, where they still reside, in the treasuries of Venice and the cathedrals of France. The bronze horses that had stood in the hippodrome since the age of Constantine were taken to Venice and mounted on the facade of St. Mark's, where copies of them still look down on the square. The great library of Constantinople, which had preserved more of the classical inheritance than any other collection in the world, was burned, and the works of authors whose names we will now never know, historians and poets and philosophers whose words had survived for a millennium and a half, went up in the fire and vanished from the earth. The population, the women and children and the old, were put to the sword or to flight, and a Byzantine chronicler, writing in the years that followed, recorded that the Saracens, the Muslims, would have been more merciful than the soldiers of Christ. When the killing stopped and the looting was done, the Crusaders and the Venetians sat down to divide the empire among themselves. A Latin emperor, Baldwin of Flanders, was crowned in Hagia Sophia, and a Latin patriarch was installed, and the territories of the empire were carved into feudal fiefdoms. The Kingdom of Thessalonica, the Duchy of Athens, the Principality of Achaia, the Venetian islands and ports. The Byzantine Empire, as a unified state, had ceased to exist. The Queen of Cities was a Frankish colony, and the Greeks who survived the sack were subjects of a foreign emperor and a foreign church. And the great experiment of Constantine and Justinian, the Roman Empire of the East, seemed, in the spring of 1204, to have reached its end. But it had not reached its end. The Roman state had been shattered before, and it had always reassembled itself from fragments, and it did so again, though it would never regain what it had lost. In the chaos of the fall, 3 Greek successor states coalesced around the edges of the former empire: the Empire of Nicaea, in western Anatolia, under a capable dynasty of generals and diplomats; the Despotate of Epirus, in the mountains of northwestern Greece; and the Empire of Trebizond, on the Black Sea coast, founded by descendants of the Komnenoi who had fled Constantinople before the sack. Of these, Nicaea was the most successful, the most ambitious, and the most determined to recover the lost capital. For 57 years, the Nicene emperors, pragmatic, patient, and methodical, rebuilt the institutions of the Byzantine state in exile, recovered territory from the Latins and the Turks, and waited for the moment when Constantinople, the city of their ancestors and the heart of their civilization, could be taken back. That moment came in 1261, and it came almost by accident. A Nicene general, Alexios Strategopoulos, was scouting near the city with a small force and learned that the Latin garrison and fleet were absent, raiding elsewhere in the Black Sea. The city, the mightiest fortress in the world, was virtually undefended. A few men slipped through a postern gate, overwhelmed the guards, and opened the main gates from within, and the Nicene army poured into Constantinople and took it without a siege, without a battle, in a single night. The Latin emperor, Baldwin II, fled in a Venetian ship, and the Byzantine emperor, Michael Palaeologus, entered the city a few weeks later in a triumph that was not quite the triumph of old, because the city he entered was a ruin. The palaces were derelict, the great houses boarded up, the population a fraction of what it had been before the sack. Whole quarters had been abandoned for 2 generations and were returning to fields and orchards. The hippodrome was a quarry. The harbor, once crowded with the shipping of the world, was largely empty. The Venetians and Genoese controlled what trade remained, and the empire that Michael recovered consisted of Constantinople, the hinterland of Thrace, portions of the Aegean islands, and fragments of the Peloponnese. The rest, Anatolia, most of the Balkans, the islands, the great cities, was gone, held by the Turks, the Bulgars, the Serbs, the Latins, and the Italian republics. The restored Byzantine Empire was a Greek city-state with an emperor, the hollow shell of a greatness that had passed out of the world. The final 2 centuries of the empire, from the restoration of 1261 to the fall of 1453, are a long, slow sunset, and the men who lived through them could feel the light failing and wrote about it, and tried, with varying degrees of courage and futility, to hold off the dark. It is a melancholy period, but it is not an inglorious one, and it produced, in its final decades, a last flowering of art and thought that would, after the empire itself was gone, enrich the West in ways that the West has never fully acknowledged. The immediate threat in the late 13th century was not the Turks, but the Latins. The fall of the Latin Empire of Constantinople had been a shock to the West, and there were those, particularly the Pope and the King of Sicily, who dreamed of restoring it. Michael Palaeologus, the first of the restored emperors, spent his entire reign managing this threat, and the tools at his disposal were the traditional tools of Byzantine diplomacy: bribery, marriage alliance, the promise of church union, the endless playing of one Western power against another. The most controversial of these tools, and the one that would divide the empire more bitterly than any enemy, was the union of the churches. The schism between the Greek and Latin churches, which had been developing for centuries and had hardened into formal separation by the 11th century, was, in Byzantine eyes, almost entirely the fault of the Latins, who had added the word filioque to the creed, who insisted on unleavened bread in the Eucharist, who demanded the submission of the Eastern patriarchs to the Roman Pope. But the West was powerful, and the empire was desperate, and Michael Palaeologus, a calculating man, understood that a formal submission to Rome, however insincere, might protect Constantinople against a crusade of restoration. In 1274, at the Council of Lyons, The emperor's envoys accepted the papal conditions. The Greek Church would acknowledge the supremacy of the Pope and the correctness of the Latin doctrine. The union was proclaimed, and the Pope, satisfied, restrained those who wished to reconquer Constantinople. But the union was a fiction, and everyone knew it. The clergy and people of the empire, with a few exceptions, rejected it with a vehemence that astonished the emperor and his Frankish allies. The monks, who were the conscience of the Orthodox laity, and who had been the defenders of the icons in the 8th century, led the opposition. The emperor's own sister declared that she would rather see the Turkish turban in Constantinople than the Latin mitre, a sentiment that would echo, with terrible irony, through the centuries that followed. Michael imprisoned and mutilated opponents of the union, including members of his own family, and it made no difference. The union was never accepted in the East, and when Michael died in 1282, his successor, his son Andronikos, abandoned it at once, and the schism resumed, and the empire, having traded its religious integrity for a temporary political respite, found that it had won little and lost much of its own cohesion and self-respect. Meanwhile, in Anatolia, a new power was rising, and it was growing with a speed that the emperors in Constantinople, absorbed in Western intrigues, were too slow to recognize. The collapse of the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum, which had ruled central Anatolia since the 11th century, left a vacuum that was filled by a number of small Turkish principalities, the Beyliks, which competed among themselves for territory and power. One of these, in the northwestern corner of Anatolia, on the frontier directly opposite Constantinople across the Sea of Marmara, was ruled by a chieftain named Osman, and his followers, the Osmanli, became known in the West as the Ottomans. They were, at first, only one among many, a small band of frontier raiders, Ghazis, warriors for the faith, who lived by raiding the Byzantine territories and attracting adventurers from deeper in the Turkish lands. But their position was extraordinarily favorable. They were closest to Constantinople, closest to the richest remaining Byzantine lands, closest to the sea, and they were well led, generation after generation, by a dynasty that produced, with a consistency rare in history, capable and ambitious rulers. Osman's son Orhan captured the city of Bursa in 1326, across the sea from Constantinople, and made it his capital. The Ottomans had acquired a state. The 14th century saw the grinding, inch-by-inch advance of the Ottomans into Byzantine territory, and the inability of the empire to resist them. And the reasons for that inability are the usual reasons of a declining state: a shrinking population, an empty treasury, a political class consumed by civil war. The empire of the Paleologi in the 14th century was not one state but a patchwork of semi-independent lordships, each ruled by a member of the extended imperial family or by a local magnate, and the emperors in Constantinople could barely command the loyalty of their own relatives. In 1341, the death of the Emperor Andronikos III triggered a civil war between the regency for his young son and the usurpation of a rival claimant, John Cantacuzene, and the war lasted 6 years and tore the remnant of the empire apart. Both sides hired Turkish mercenaries who used the opportunity to pillage the countryside and establish themselves on the European shore of the Dardanelles. And when the war was over, the Ottomans, who had been called in as allies, had a permanent foothold in Europe, within striking distance of Constantinople and Thrace. The Civil War also saw the rise of a radical social movement, the Zealots of Thessalonica, who seized the second city of the empire and ruled it for 7 years as a kind of commune, the closest medieval Europe ever came to a genuine revolution of the poor. And the episode, like so many in the late Byzantine centuries, reads as a symptom of a society breaking apart, its old certainties dissolving, its people looking for answers that the traditional structures could not provide. The Ottomans, in the decades that followed, swallowed the Balkans piece by piece. In 1354, an earthquake damaged the fortifications of Gallipoli, the town commanding the European shore of the Dardanelles, and the Ottomans, who had occupied a nearby fortress, moved in and took possession, and they never left. Adrianople, the great city of Thrace and one of the historic capitals of the Ottoman state, fell in 1365. The Serbs, who had built a powerful empire in the Central Balkans under their great king Stefan Dušan, were crushed at the Battle of Kosovo in 1389, a date so laden with meaning in the national memory of Serbia that it still echoes in the politics of the region today. And after Kosovo, the Bulgarian kingdom fell, and the Ottoman frontier was on the Danube, and Constantinople was an island in a Turkish sea, connected to its remaining European territories only by the uncertain threads of the Black Sea shipping lanes. And still, the empire survived. The city itself, the great fortress, held out behind its walls, supplied by sea, blockaded but never stormed, and the Ottoman sultans, for a century, were unable or unwilling to take the final step. The first Ottoman siege of Constantinople came in 1394, under Sultan Bayezid, known as the Thunderbolt, and it lasted 8 years, the longest siege the city had ever endured. Bayezid had blockaded the city by land and by sea, and the population was starving, and the emperor, Manuel II, was sending desperate embassies to every court in Europe, and it seemed, to everyone watching, that the end had come. And then, in 1402, from the east, came the unexpected deliverance. Timur, known to the west as Tamerlane, the last of the great Mongol conquerors, swept into Anatolia, and Bayezid, forced to raise the siege and march east to meet him, was defeated and captured at the Battle of Ankara, the first and only time a reigning Ottoman sultan was taken in battle, and the Ottoman state, which Bayezid had built so rapidly, collapsed into a decade of civil war among his sons. The siege was lifted. Constantinople and the empire had been given, by forces entirely beyond its control, another half-century of life. It was a gift that the empire could not use. The decades after Ankara were occupied by the Ottoman Civil War, and then by the rebuilding of the Ottoman state under a series of able sultans who learned the lessons of Bayezid's overreach. And by the time the Ottomans were ready to turn their full attention to Constantinople again, the empire had been reduced to nothing. The city itself, a few islands in the Aegean, and the despotate of the Morea in the Peloponnese, a small Byzantine principality ruled by the emperor's brothers. The population of Constantinople, which had been perhaps 400,000 in the 12th century and perhaps 100,000 after the Latin Restoration, had fallen by the middle of the 15th century to perhaps 50,000 or less, scattered among the ruins of the great city, farming gardens within the walls, fishing from the sea walls, worshipping in churches that were themselves decaying, their mosaics dimmed by neglect and poverty. The emperor, the last of the Paleology, was a man named Constantine the 11th, who had been despot of the Morea before his brother's death called him to the throne. And he was, by all the accounts that survive, a brave and dignified man who understood his situation with perfect clarity and chose, as his ancestors had chosen at every crisis of the empire's history, to fight. It is worth pausing on the name before the final chapter. Constantine, the first Christian emperor, the founder of the city, the man who had seen the cross in the sky above the Milvian Bridge, was Constantine, and the last emperor, the man who would die in the breach of the walls, was Constantine too. The symmetry is too perfect for history to have arranged it deliberately, and yet there it is, one of those uncanny patterns that make the chronicles of empires read, in the end, like a story composed by an author with a taste for closure. The first Constantine had dedicated his city to the Virgin, who was her special protector, and the last Constantine fought his final battle under the same protection, and the men who survived the fall and wrote about it afterward saw, in the convergence of names, a sign that the story had come full circle, that the empire which had begun with a Constantine could only end with one. The Sultan who commanded the siege was Mehmed II, known to history as Mehmed the Conqueror, and he was, in the spring of 1453, 21 years old. He had come to the throne 2 years earlier, after the death of his father Murad, and he had inherited, along with the Ottoman domains in Asia and Europe, a fixed determination to take Constantinople, the city whose possession, he believed, was essential to the unity and security of his empire. The city was a Christian dagger thrust into the Muslim flank, a base from which a Western crusade could, at any time, land and march. And as long as it held out, the Ottoman position in Europe was never entirely secure. Beyond the strategic calculus, there was also in Mehmed a genuine hunger for the city, a sense that its conquest would crown his reign and place him among the great rulers of history. And the ambition was something his contemporaries recognized and his biographers recorded. The young sultan, the chroniclers say, could think of nothing but the city, spoke of nothing, dreamed of it at night, and drove his engineers and his generals with a ferocity that left no room for hesitation or delay. The siege of 1453 is one of the most famous and most written about episodes in the history of war, and the outlines of it are well known. But the details, even at this distance, have the power to move anyone who sits with them for a while. The Ottoman army that gathered before the walls in April of that year was enormous, perhaps 80,000 men, perhaps more. The largest force the Ottomans had ever fielded, drawn from every province of their empire, and it was equipped with the most advanced artillery train in the world, cast by a Hungarian engineer named Urban, who had first offered his services to the Byzantine Emperor, and had been turned away because the emperor had no money to pay him, and who then took his skills to the Sultan and built the guns that would shatter the walls. The Great Bombard, the largest cannon ever cast up to that time, fired a stone shot that weighed half a ton, and the chroniclers record that it took 60 oxen and hundreds of men to drag it from the foundry at Adrianople to the siege lines before the city, a journey of weeks, and that when it fired, the sound could be heard for miles across the Bosporus, and the wall it struck shuddered and crumbled, and the defenders, scrambling to repair the breach at night, knew that they were fighting against a weapon that no wall on earth could resist indefinitely. The defenders, by contrast, numbered perhaps 7,000, of whom a significant portion were not Byzantines at all but Genoese and Venetian volunteers, sailors and soldiers of fortune who had come to the city in the months before the siege, partly out of religious solidarity and partly out of the fierce commercial calculation that a Turkish Constantinople would be a disaster for Italian trade. The greatest of the Italian captains was Giovanni Giustiniani, a Genoese nobleman who arrived with a company of professional soldiers and who took command of the land walls, the critical sector, and who fought, by all accounts, with a courage and competence that held the defense together for weeks. The defenders had little artillery, and what they had could barely be fired without damaging the walls they were meant to protect. They had no fleet to speak of, only the ships that had been caught in the harbor when the siege began, and the Ottoman fleet, blockading the city from the sea, cut off all reinforcement except what could slip through in the dark. And the emperor, Constantine, made his headquarters at the most vulnerable point of the walls, the Lycus Valley, where the fortifications crossed a shallow depression that had always been the weakest point in the city's perimeter, and where Mehmed had concentrated his heaviest guns. The siege lasted 53 days, from the 6th of April to the 29th of May, and the rhythm of it was the rhythm of all medieval sieges: bombardment by day, repairs by night, assaults repulsed, mining and countermining under the walls, the slow erosion of the defenders' strength and the defenders' hope, punctuated by moments of extraordinary courage and extraordinary strangeness. There was the night when the defenders, sallying out to destroy an Ottoman siege tower, found themselves fighting hand to hand in the darkness and prevailed, and the morning when the chain across the Golden Horn, which protected the northern flank of the city, was bypassed by an Ottoman fleet that had been dragged overland on greased rollers across the ridge behind Galata and relaunched into the harbor behind the chain, a feat of engineering that astonished the defenders and meant that the city was now besieged by sea as well as by land. There was the day when the defenders, in the great church of Hagia Sophia, gathered for a final liturgy, the last Christian service ever held under that dome, with the emperor and the patriarch and the Latin and Greek defenders united for one moment, in common prayer, setting aside, at the very end, the schism that had divided them for centuries. And there was the night of the 28th of May, the last night of the Roman Empire. The emperor, having done everything that a commander could do, having refused the Sultan's offer of honorable surrender, having patrolled the walls and encouraged his men and made his final dispositions, spent the last hours of the empire in the great church of Hagia Sophia, the same church that Justinian had built 1,000 years before, and he received communion, and he asked forgiveness of everyone he had wronged, and then he rode out in the darkness to the walls. The moon was nearly full, and a lunar eclipse had darkened it in the early hours of the night, and the defenders, who were as superstitious as all medieval men, took the eclipse as a sign of doom, and the clergy had to reassure them that the prophecies said the city would fall under a waxing moon, and the moon was now waning, and perhaps the prophecies were wrong. Constantine took his station at the St. Romanus Gate, at the head of the Lycus Valley, where the walls had been battered almost to rubble, and he waited for the dawn. The final assault began in the small hours of the morning of the 29th. Mehmed, who had driven his army for 53 days and was determined to finish it, sent his irregular troops in first, the Bashi Bazouks, poorly armed and undisciplined, and the defenders, fighting from the walls, cut them down in heaps, and the survivors fled. And for a moment, on the ramparts, there must have been a surge of hope. But the purpose of the first wave had been simply to exhaust the defenders, and the second wave, the regular Anatolian infantry, came on immediately behind the first, and the defenders, already tired, already depleted, fought them hand to hand in the breaches for hours and held them too. And then, before the defenders could recover, the third wave came, the Janissaries, the Sultan's household troops, the finest infantry in Europe, fresh and disciplined and fanatical, and they rushed the Lycus breach just as the first light of dawn was touching the Sea of Marmara. It was in this moment, with the battle hanging in the balance, that the first of the two fatal accidents occurred. Giustiniani, the Genoese captain who had commanded the landward defenses for the entire siege, was badly wounded, and whether the wound was fatal or not, he lost his nerve or his strength, and he ordered his men to carry him from the walls toward the harbor, where a Genoese ship was waiting. The emperor begged him to stay, and he refused, or could not, and the sight of the great captain retreating broke the morale of the defenders at the critical point, and the Janissaries, seeing the confusion, surged forward and gained a foothold on the wall. And then the second accident, so small and so decisive. In the wall north of the Lycus Valley, there was a small postern gate, the Kerkoporta, which had been left open or partly open after a sortie the night before, and a party of Janissaries found it, slipped through, and raised their banner on the tower above. The cry went up in the streets behind the walls. The city is taken, the Turks are inside. The defense, which had held for hours against the full strength of the Ottoman army, collapsed in minutes. The Genoese and Venetians, seeing the Turkish banners on the towers and the Janissaries pouring through the breach, fled for their ships in the harbor. The Greek defenders, abandoned by their allies, were cut down where they stood. And Constantine, the last emperor of the Romans, seeing that the battle was lost and that the city was falling, did something that has been disputed and elaborated and mythologized ever since. But the core of it is beyond dispute. He did not flee. He stripped off his imperial regalia, the purple boots and the double-headed eagle, so that his body would not be recognized, and made a trophy, and he plunged into the melee at the St. Romanus Gate, and he was never seen alive again. The chroniclers differ on the details. Some say he was cut down fighting, sword in hand, a common soldier's death. Some say he was trampled in the press at the gate. Some say his body was recovered and identified by the purple boots he had forgotten to remove, and his head was paraded through the city. The truth, as with so many of the deaths that end these long stories, is that nobody who saw it lived to tell it. Or if they lived, they told it in so many versions that the man himself vanished into the legend. He was 48 years old. He had reigned for 4 years, and he was the last of 88 emperors, going back to Augustus, who had ruled the Roman Empire from the city on the Bosporus. After him, nothing. The line ends in the breach of the wall, in the gray light of a Tuesday morning, and the empire that had called itself Roman for 2,000 years was gone. The sack that followed was, by the standards of medieval warfare, restrained, and that restraint is worth noting because it was deliberate, and it tells you something about Mehmed the Conqueror that distinguishes him from many of the conquerors who fill these stories. The Sultan had promised his army 3 days of plunder, as was the custom of the age, and he allowed it. But he also, by the middle of the first day, began to rein it in. The great churches were not burned. The population was not massacred wholesale. The city was to be his capital, and a capital populated by corpses and rubble serves no conqueror's purpose. The Sultan entered the city in the afternoon, rode directly to Hagia Sophia, dismounted, and entered the great church that had been the spiritual center of Eastern Christendom for 900 years. He spoke a prayer and declared the church a mosque, and the long transformation of Constantinople into Istanbul had begun. The aftermath of the fall is as full of strangeness and contradiction as anything that came before it. The conqueror, Mehmed, did not see himself merely as a destroyer of the Roman Empire. He saw himself, and his successors would see themselves, as its heir. He took the title Caesari Rum, Caesar of the Romans, and he claimed, with some justice, that he had succeeded where every Muslim conqueror before him had failed, and that the Ottoman Sultanate was, in its imperial dignity, the continuation of the Roman imperial line. The Greek Patriarchate was allowed to continue, under Ottoman protection, and the Orthodox Church, which had feared annihilation, found that the Sultan preferred to govern his Christian subjects through their own clergy, and the Patriarch, in his vestments and his palace, became an Ottoman official, a tax farmer for the Christian population, a servant of the Sultan in the administration of the empire's most numerous minority. The city, depopulated by the long decline and the siege, was repopulated with Muslims and Christians and Jews from across the Ottoman domains, and it grew again, over the following century, into the great metropolis of the Ottoman Empire, a city of mosques and minarets and covered bazaars, the capital of an empire that would stretch at its height, from Hungary to Yemen and from Algeria to the Caucasus, an empire whose sultans would claim, with no more exaggeration than the Byzantine emperors before them, to be the masters of the world. But the fall of Constantinople was also, and this is the part of the story that has reverberated ever since, a shock that ran through all of Christendom, and the shock was not merely the loss of a city, however ancient and however sacred. The fall of the city that had guarded the eastern frontier of Europe for 1,000 years, the city that had stopped the Arabs in the 7th century and the Bulgars in the 10th and a dozen other enemies in between, meant that the Ottoman Empire was now a European power with a base in the heart of the continent, and for the next 2.5 centuries, the Ottomans would press northward through the Balkans, to the walls of Vienna, twice, in 1529 and 1683, and the fear of the Turk would haunt the European imagination in ways that are difficult, now, to recover. The refugees from Constantinople, the Greek scholars who fled the fall with their manuscripts and their learning, carried the classical inheritance westward, and their arrival in Italy, which was already in the first flowering of the Renaissance, fed a revival of Greek learning that would transform the intellectual life of Europe. The Greek texts that had been preserved in the libraries of Constantinople, the philosophers and the poets and the mathematicians, the works of Plato and Aristotle and the dramatists and the historians, had been kept alive through the long Byzantine centuries by scribes and scholars whose names we mostly do not know, and their work, carried westward in the sacks of refugees fleeing the fall, would become the foundation of the Western classical tradition. The Renaissance, in a sense that is not always acknowledged, was paid for by Byzantium, and the idea of Byzantium, the ghost of the vanished empire, haunted the centuries that followed in ways that are still with us. The Russians, who had accepted Christianity from Constantinople and who had been, for half a millennium, the most faithful spiritual children of the Byzantine Church, declared Moscow the Third Rome, the successor to the Rome of the Caesars and the Rome of Constantine, and the Russian czars took the double-headed eagle as their symbol and claimed with a seriousness that their enemies often mocked, but that they themselves believed to be the heirs of the Roman Empire. The title, the claim, the imperial ideology, lasted until the Russian Revolution of 1917, and in those last years, the Romanov Tsar was still being crowned in a ceremony that consciously echoed the Byzantine rituals, and the Russian Church was still praying for the emperor, the Orthodox emperor, who had not existed since 1453. The idea of Byzantium, the dream of a Christian empire ordained by God to rule the world in righteousness, outlived the empire itself by half a millennium, and it still echoes, in attenuated and transmuted forms, in the Orthodox churches of Eastern Europe and the Levant, in the icons and the liturgies and the sense, never quite extinguished, that something was lost on that Tuesday morning in 1453 that the world has never replaced. And so we come, at last, to the end of the long story, and it is worth pausing, in the quiet that follows, to ask the question that stories like this one always leave behind. What, in the final accounting, did the Byzantine Empire actually do? It did not conquer the world, as Rome did. Its name is not written across the map, as Rome's is, in the names of nations and the roots of languages and the codes of law. It lost more than it won. It spent more centuries in retreat than in advance. It ended, in the most literal sense, in failure, its city taken, its emperor dead, its state extinguished. And yet, when you look at what it preserved and what it transmitted and what it made possible, the balance shifts. The Byzantine Empire kept the classical tradition alive through the long centuries when the West had lost it. It converted the Slavs and gave them an alphabet and a liturgy and a civilization. It preserved Roman law and transmitted it, eventually, to the West. It held the eastern frontier of Europe against the Arab conquest for 4 centuries, through the 7th and 8th and 9th and 10th, and it bought, with its own blood and treasure, the time that Europe needed to develop the institutions and the strength that would eventually, in the centuries after the fall, push the frontier back. If Constantinople had fallen to the Arabs in the 7th century, the history of Europe and the history of the world would have been different, and no one can say how different. But it is safe to say that the difference would have been immeasurable. The Byzantine Empire was the shield of Europe, and it broke in the end. But it broke only after holding for 1,000 years, and the world behind it, the world that had grown up in the shadow of its protection, was strong enough by the time of the fall to survive the storm. And there is something else, something less tangible but perhaps more important, that the empire left behind, the idea of it. The idea of a Christian empire, Orthodox in faith and Roman in law, and Greek in language, governing a commonwealth of peoples under the protection of the Virgin and the authority of the emperor, lasted far longer than the empire itself. It shaped the self-understanding of the Russian Church and the Russian state for centuries. It shaped the identity of the Orthodox peoples of the Balkans through the long centuries of Ottoman rule, when the memory of Byzantium, the memory of the Christian empire that had once been theirs, was a consolation and a hope. It shaped the imagination of the West, which alternately admired and despised the Byzantines, which borrowed their art and their learning while dismissing their politics, which still, in the great museums of Europe and America, displays the icons and the ivories and the manuscripts that the empire left behind, beautiful and alien and compelling, the artifacts of a civilization that was, for 1,000 years, the most cultivated in the world. The last image of the empire, the one I want to leave with you as the lights go down, is not the breach in the wall or the fall of the city. but something quieter. In the centuries after the fall, the Greeks of Constantinople, the Rum as the Ottomans called them, the Romans, continued to live in the city, to worship in their churches, to speak their language, to keep the memory of the empire alive in their families and their songs and their prayers. The patriarchate continued, and the liturgy continued, and the icons continued to be painted, and the children continued to be baptized with the names of the saints and the emperors. The empire was gone, but the people, the Rum, the Romans, endured. And they endured for 5 centuries under Ottoman rule. And some of their descendants still live in Istanbul today, a tiny community in the city that was once the capital of their world. And on the night of the 29th of May, every year, the Greeks of the city, and the Greeks of the diaspora, and the scholars and the pilgrims who come to remember, gather quietly or in their own private ways to mark the fall. The last emperor, Constantine Palaeologus, has no grave, and no one knows where his body lies, and the legend that grew up around him in the centuries after the fall says that he never died, that an angel turned him to marble and hid him in a cave beneath the Golden Gate, and that he will return one day, when the city is Greek again, to complete the liturgy that was interrupted on that Tuesday morning. It is a legend, only a legend, and it is not true, but it carries a truth that facts cannot carry. That the memory of Byzantium has never been entirely extinguished, and that the desire for what was lost, the longing for the city that was the queen of cities and the empire that was the bulwark of Christendom, is still alive. In the liturgies and the songs and the quiet commemorations of a people who have never, in 500 years, forgotten what they were. The Byzantine Empire lasted 1123 years, from the dedication of Constantinople in 330 to the fall of the walls in 1453. It was, by any measure, one of the longest-lived political entities in the history of the world, and it survived through plagues and invasions and civil wars and theological convulsions with a tenacity that has few parallels. It was not always admirable. It was often cruel, often treacherous, often consumed by disputes that seem, to modern eyes, incomprehensibly trivial. But it was also brave, and learned, and pious, and, in its long middle centuries, the light of the world when the world was very dark. It preserved what would otherwise have been lost, and it transmitted what it had preserved. And the civilization we inhabit, whether we know it or not, is built partly on its foundations. The Roman Empire did not fall in 476, whatever the school books say. It moved east, and it changed, and it endured for another 1,000 years, and when it finally fell, it fell fighting, and its last emperor died in the breach, and its memory, its stubborn, enduring, half-forgotten memory, is still with us. In the icons and the liturgies and the quiet of a Tuesday night in May, when the last of the Romans are remembered, and the empire that was Rome lives on, in the only way empires ever truly live on, in the minds of those who remember. If you are still awake out there, thank you for keeping me company through the whole long journey, through the camp of Constantine and the dome of Justinian, through the siege of Heraclius and the triumph of orthodoxy, through the Crusades and the sack and the long, slow sunset of the last Palaeology. There is a kind of peace, I think, in stories like this one, the peace of watching even the mightiest things of this world, its empires and its walls and its certainties, soften slowly into history, into telling, into a voice in a dark room. Whatever is pressing on you tonight, it too is smaller than an empire, and it too will pass through its noon and its afternoon and its dusk, and become, one day, only a story. Another story will be waiting on the screen whenever you are ready for it, and it will keep until morning. If you enjoyed this one, feel free to like and subscribe, or to leave a thought down in the comments below, and perhaps your location and your local time, so that some other sleepless soul, somewhere far away, might know they are not the only one awake beneath the dark. But for now, there is nothing left to defend, and nowhere left to sail. Close your eyes and let yourself drift off to sleep. Good night and sweet dreams.